In medieval Europe, children's birthdays bore little resemblance to modern celebrations, with their multi-tiered cakes adorned with frosting, piñatas bursting with candies, colorful balloons floating everywhere, and carefully curated playlists to liven up the party. The Middle Ages, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, was a time defined by the daily struggle for survival, the omnipresence of religion, and a collective mindset where individual milestones like birthdays often took a back seat to the needs of the community, family responsibilities, and religious festivals that shaped the calendar. However, this doesn't mean children's birthdays were entirely overlooked. Families and communities found ways, often subtle and deeply rooted in faith and tradition, to commemorate another year in a child's life, whether through small domestic gestures, spiritual rituals, or modest celebrations that reflected the values, constraints, and cultural nuances of the era. Let's dive into the details of how medieval children celebrated their birthdays, exploring religious traditions, regional differences, games, food, gifts, social dynamics, and cultural influences that shaped these occasions, with a touch of light humor to keep us connected to the human spirit that, even in tough times, found ways to celebrate life. The historical context is crucial to understanding these celebrations. The Middle Ages was a period dominated by the Catholic Church, which not only dictated spiritual beliefs but also organized the rhythm of daily life through the liturgical calendar. Festivals like Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, All Saints' Day, or days dedicated to popular saints were the central events of the year, and birthdays, especially those of children, didn't hold the same significance as they do today. In many cases, the feast day of a child's patron saint or the religious festival closest to their birth date took precedence. For example, a child named Michael, born near September 29th, the feast of Saint Michael the Archangel, could expect their family to celebrate the saint's day more than their actual birthday. These festivals included solemn masses in the village church or city cathedral, colorful processions where villagers carried embroidered banners, lit candles, or small wooden images of the saint, and, in some cases, fairs, feasts, or community gatherings. Children could enjoy these occasions, eating a bit more than usual, playing with other children in the village square, or receiving small gifts like a honey sweet, a copper coin to spend at the fair, or a colorful ribbon to adorn their clothes. In this sense, a child's birthday became an excuse to join in the collective joy, though the focus was not exclusively on them but on the community and its shared devotion. For children of the lower classes, who made up the vast majority of the population, birthdays were especially understated. Peasant life was a daily struggle. From the age of 5 or 6, children helped with tasks like gathering firewood in the forest, tending to sheep, goats, or chickens, grinding grain in a stone mortar, fetching water from a well or river, or assisting with the harvest of wheat, barley, or rye. In this context, organizing a party as we know it today, with decorations and planned entertainment, was simply unthinkable. However, families made small efforts to mark the day, showing their love and gratitude within the limits of their resources. In rural areas of England, for instance, a mother might spend hours hand-grinding wheat or rye to bake a special loaf, perhaps with a touch of honey if the family had access to a beehive or could afford to buy it at a local market. This bread, far from resembling modern frosted cakes, was a luxury in a diet that typically consisted of oatmeal porridge, turnip, cabbage, or leek soup, or rock-hard black bread. In some regions of France, such as Normandy, Brittany, or Anjou, families might prepare a heartier soup, perhaps with a fresh egg, a piece of bacon, or a bit of hard cheese, as a way to celebrate that the child had survived another year in a world where infant mortality was alarmingly high, with rates reaching 30 to 50% before age 5 due to disease, malnutrition, or accidents. In German villages, like those in Bavaria or Saxony, families might share a dish of lentils or beans cooked with wild herbs like thyme, rosemary, or sage, grown nearby, as a small gesture of celebration that added a touch of flavor to the daily routine. Among the upper classes, such as the nobility, knights, or wealthy merchants in cities, birthdays could have a bit more flair, though they were still modest compared to modern celebrations. Children from noble families often began the day with a blessing in the family chapel, a small but often richly decorated space with religious frescoes, simple stained glass, or a carved wooden cross. A priest, sometimes a chaplain hired by the family, offered prayers for the child's health, longevity, and divine protection, especially significant in an era when diseases like the bubonic plague, dysentery, smallpox, whooping cough, or even a simple cold could be fatal. Parents might commission a gift, such as a new tunic embroidered with colored threads, red, blue, or green, depending on available dyes, a leather belt with a metal buckle, a dyed wool cloak in vibrant colors, or a religious amulet, like a hand-carved wooden cross, a bronze medallion with the image of the child's patron saint, such as Saint John the Baptist, Saint Margaret, or Saint Nicholas, or even a minor relic, like a fragment of cloth said to have touched a holy relic. These objects were not just tokens of affection but also investments in the child's spiritual protection, as faith in divine intercession was a constant in medieval life. For example, in a 13th century Castilian noble family, a boy turning 8 might receive a small ceremonial dagger with a handle decorated with bone or horn inlays, not for use but as a symbol of his future entry into the chivalric world, where he would learn to wield a sword and ride a horse. In cities, the children of merchants might receive a leather-bound prayer book, a silver coin minted at a local mint, like those in London, Paris, or Venice, a simple copper ring, or even a small polished metal mirror. Gifts that may seem modest today but were treasures in an era where money and material goods were scarce and hard to come by. A central aspect of medieval birthdays was the connection between names and saints. In the Middle Ages, children's names were often chosen based on the liturgical calendar, meaning many shared names with popular saints, such as Mary, John, Catherine, Peter, Elizabeth, Thomas, Margaret, James, Lucy, or Stephen. This practice created a special bond between the child and their patron saint, considered a spiritual protector and intercessor before God. For example, a girl named Catherine, born near November 25th, the feast of Saint Catherine of Alexandria, might expect her family to celebrate the saint's day more than her actual birthday if the dates didn't align. Saints' Day festivities were communal events, with solemn masses in the village church or city cathedral, where the faithful sang hymns and offered prayers, colorful processions where villagers carried embroidered banners, lit candles, or small wooden or plaster statues of the saint, and, in some cases, fairs, feasts, or community gatherings that could last all day. Children could enjoy these occasions, eating a bit more than usual, playing with other children in the village square, or receiving small gifts, like a honey sweet, a copper coin to spend at the fair, a colorful ribbon to adorn their clothes, or even a simple toy, such as a wooden whistle, a leather ball stuffed with straw, or a carved animal figure. In rural areas, Saints' Day fairs might include stalls where artisans sold these toys, which parents could buy for their children as a special gift, though the cost of a whistle or ball might represent a day's wages. In this sense, a child's birthday became an excuse to participate in collective joy, though the focus was not exclusively on them but on the community and its shared devotion to the saint. Speaking of sweets, while birthday cakes with candles, frosting, and elaborate decorations were unknown, medieval children weren't entirely deprived of treats, and a birthday could be the perfect occasion to enjoy something special. In rural areas, poorer families might prepare a loaf sweetened with honey, a compote of dried fruits, like figs, plums, raisins, or dates, depending on the region. Or, in areas where apples grew, like Normandy, Brittany, the Low Countries, or northern England, a baked apple with a touch of honey or aromatic herbs like cinnamon, anise, or cloves, if the family had access to these rare spices, often obtained through trade with the Mediterranean or the East. In English villages, a mother might spend the morning gathering wild apples, blackberries, or currants in the forest to prepare a simple dessert, which the child shared with their siblings, grinning from ear to ear, savoring each bite as if it were a royal delicacy. In southern regions, like Tuscany, Provence, the Crown of Aragon, or Al-Andalus, families might prepare a thick paste with dried figs, grapes, or apricots, sweetened with honey or, in rare cases, sugar, an exotic product just beginning to reach Europe via Arab trade routes. In cities, where bakers and confectioners' guilds were starting to thrive, especially in the late medieval period, 13th to 15th centuries, children from wealthier families could enjoy more elaborate treats, like marzipan, candied fruits, such as oranges, lemons, or quinces in Mediterranean regions, small almond cakes, gingerbread, which was becoming popular in cities like Nuremberg, Bruges, Cologne, or London, or even hard biscuits decorated with cumin, anise, or poppy seeds. These delicacies were rare and expensive, so receiving one on a birthday was a memorable event. something a child could brag about to their friends for weeks. Imagine a child in 14th century Paris, holding a honey-coated nut or a candied pear as if it were a jewel, while their siblings looked on with a mix of envy and fascination, hoping for a tiny piece. That small sweet could be the highlight of their day, likely remembered as one of the best moments of their childhood. If you're enjoying this journey to the past, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. There, you'll find more fascinating stories about medieval life, told with a touch of humor and curious facts that will make you see history from a new perspective. Hit the subscribe button and join the historical adventure. Celebrations varied significantly depending on the region, climate, local culture, and social status, adding a fascinating richness to how birthdays were experienced in the Middle Ages. In Northern Europe, where winters were long and harsh, birthdays in colder months like November, December, or January could be more introspective, almost like a family gathering around a crackling fire in a wooden hut or stone house. Families huddled indoors, sharing a hot stew of lentils, barley, turnips, cabbages, or leeks, seasoned with wild herbs like thyme, rosemary, or sage, and perhaps telling stories about ancestors, saints, local legends, or even the mischief of elves and spirits that populated medieval folklore. In rural areas of Scandinavia, like Norway, Sweden, or Denmark, a child celebrating a winter birthday might receive a small carved wooden amulet with protective runes, such as algies, associated with protection, or tawaz, linked to strength and honor, reflecting the lingering influence of pagan traditions in Christian culture. In some villages, families might share a fermented barley drink, non-alcoholic for children, of course, served in a ceremonial horn or wooden bowl passed from hand to hand as a symbol of unity and gratitude for the child's life. In these regions, where cold could be relentless and nights were long, the warmth of the hearth and family company were the true gifts, and a child might feel special simply by sitting closer to the fire, receiving an extra blanket for the night, or hearing a longer-than-usual story. In southern Europe, like Tuscany, southern France, Provence, Languedoc, Aquitaine, the crown of Aragon, Castile, or Al-Andalus, birthdays in spring or summer might coincide with outdoor festivals, giving them a more lively and communal character. In cities like Siena, Florence, Barcelona, Valencia, Toledo, or Cordoba, children could participate in communal games, such as foot races, rudimentary ball games with leather balls stuffed with straw or rags, or even simple theatrical performances organized by the community, often tied to a religious festival dedicated to a local saint or a celebration like St. John's Day on June 24th. During these festivals, adults might toss flowers, rose petals, copper coins, or small sweets to the crowd, and children would scramble to collect them, laughing and shoving each other in joyful chaos that left everyone dusty but happy. In the squares of Italian cities like Siena or Venice, children might play games like the rope game, an early version of tug-of-war where two teams competed to pull the other, or blind hen, where one child, blindfolded with a cloth, tried to catch the others as they ran in circles around them, shouting and laughing. In Mediterranean regions, where the climate was warmer, families might gather outdoors under an olive tree, a cypress, or in a paved courtyard to share a simple but hearty meal, with dishes like bread with olive oil, fresh cheese, olives, dried fish, or fresh fruits like grapes, figs, or pomegranates, depending on the season and region. An important detail is that birthdays weren't always celebrated on the exact date, especially in rural areas where precise calendars were rare and literacy was low. Families might recall a child's birth in general terms, such as when the river flooded, after the wheat harvest, when it snowed heavily, when the new priest came to the village, or even when the white calf was born. This meant birthdays were sometimes celebrated on an approximate date or merged with a nearby religious festival, like a saint's day, Christmas, Easter, or Epiphany. For instance, a child born in late December might have their birthday absorbed into Christmas celebrations, when families attended solemn masses in churches decorated with holly, ivy, or mistletoe and shared a more abundant meal with white bread, roasted meat, like pork or lamb, if they could afford it, fish in coastal areas, or a special stew with spices like cloves or cinnamon, reserved for important occasions. During Epiphany on January 6th, families might celebrate with a special bread containing a coin, a dried bean, or a small figure, a tradition believed to have inspired the modern king's cake, where the child who found the object was crowned king for the day, to everyone's delight. In cities, especially after the 13th century, parish records became more common, allowing for more precise tracking of birth dates, as baptisms, typically performed a few days after birth, were carefully recorded in church books, often with quill and ink on parchment. However, even in these cases, birthday celebrations remained secondary to religious priorities, like attending Mass or participating in processions, or the practical demands of daily life, such as preparing for the harvest, paying taxes to the feudal lord, repairing agricultural tools, or stocking provisions for winter. Religion was the cornerstone of medieval life, and birthdays were no exception. In many homes, the day began with a prayer, either at home before a small domestic altar with a wooden cross, a painted image of the patron saint, or a lit candle, or at the local church, where the priest might officiate a brief mass in honor of the child, often accompanied by liturgical chants like the Salve Regina or Te Deum. More devout families might light a candle for the child's patron saint, like Saint Peter, Saint Lucy, Saint Nicholas, or Saint Christopher, or make a small offering at the church altar, such as a loaf of bread, a copper coin, a tallow candle, a handful of aromatic herbs, like rosemary or bay, or even a fresh egg, left as thanks for the child's life. These rituals were not just displays of faith, but ways to ensure divine protection for the child in a world full of dangers, from diseases like fever, whooping cough, smallpox, or the plague to accidents in the fields, like falls from trees, injuries with farm tools, or burns from getting too close to the fire. In some regions, like Castile, Leon, Aragon, or southern France, mothers might take the child to church for a symbolic bath with holy water, especially on the first or second birthday, when the child's survival was a cause for deep gratitude. In Castile, for example, a mother might dip a linen cloth in holy water and pass it over the child's forehead, hands, and feet, praying a prayer like the Ave Maria, Our Father, or a plea to the patron saint for protection from illness and danger. In other areas, like Bavaria, Swabia, or Tyrol, families might tie a red cord around the child's arm during their first birthday, a practice blending Christian beliefs with local superstitions about warding off the evil eye, malevolent spirits, or bad air. In rural Italian communities, like those in Tuscany, Umbria, the Marche, or Lazio, mothers might place a sprig of rosemary, bay, basil, or rue under the child's pillow, believing these herbs brought good luck, protection, or peaceful dreams, often blessed by a priest before use. And if you want to dive deeper into this topic, I've linked a book in the description that explores medieval traditions in detail, from religious rituals to the small everyday moments that made this era unique. It's a must-read for anyone curious about the past. Of course, not everything was solemn. Medieval children, like those of any era, had an innate knack for finding joy in simple things, and birthdays were a chance to let that spark of fun shine, even in a world dominated by work and responsibilities. In villages, a birthday might be an excuse for children to play a bit longer than usual, a rare treat when they were often busy helping in the fields, tending animals, or doing household chores. Games varied by region, climate, and available resources, but some of the most common included stick games, where children hit a stick with another to see who could throw it farthest, often competing in a forest clearing or a vacant lot near the village. Another popular game was nut games, where children used walnuts like marbles, tossing them at a pile or a circle drawn in the dirt to score points or claim others' nuts. These games required little: a stick, some stones, a handful of walnuts, acorns, or bits of wood, and a good dose of imagination. On a birthday, parents might let the child play longer, perhaps until sunset, or give them an extra nut, a polished stone, or a small carved piece of wood to make them feel special. In rural England, children might play blind hen, a medieval precursor to the modern game, where one child, blindfolded with a linen cloth, tried to catch others as they ran in circles around them, laughing and shouting to throw them off. In regions of France, like Provence, Languedoc, or Aquitaine, children might play chase games like the wolf and the sheep, where one child played the wolf and chased the others, or the rope game, where two teams pulled on a hemp rope to test their strength, an activity that also taught teamwork and camaraderie. In cities, children of artisan, merchant, or petty bourgeois families could participate in more organized games, often mimicking adult activities and reflecting the vibrant atmosphere of medieval urban life. For example, in cities like Nuremberg, Bruges, Florence, Cologne, London, or Barcelona, children might organize small tournaments, competing in strength or skill, imitating the knights they saw in real tournaments held outside the city. In these games, they might use wooden swords carved by a local carpenter, makeshift shields from planks or wicker baskets, or spears made from polished branches, running through cobblestone streets or a courtyard while adults watched with a mix of amusement and pride. In a city like Cologne, a child might play King of the Hill, trying to stay atop a mound or pile of straw while friends tried to knock them off, laughing and shouting. In urban areas of Italy, like Venice, Genoa, or Pisa, children might play water games, like throwing stones into a canal to see who made the most ripples, building small wooden boats to float in a nearby stream, or racing along the docks, dodging barrels and fishing nets. In Mediterranean cities like Barcelona or Valencia, children might play Moors and Christians, a child's reenactment of battles between Christians and Muslims, where they split into two teams and use sticks as swords in a game full of laughter and drama. These games, though simple, made a birthday feel special, especially if the child received extra attention or a small prize, like a copper coin, a sweet, or a colorful ribbon, for winning. In noble courts, birthdays could include more sophisticated entertainment, designed to reflect the family's social status and wealth. Minstrels, troubadours, or traveling storytellers might be invited to sing or tell stories in honor of the child, creating a celebratory atmosphere blending art, devotion, and spectacle. These stories might be about saints, like Saint George slaying the dragon, Saint Martin sharing his cloak with a beggar, Saint Cecilia playing heavenly music, or Saint Nicholas giving coins to the poor, or epic tales of legendary heroes like Roland, the Cid, King Arthur, Parsifal, or Siegfried, which captured the children's imaginations and made them dream of heroic adventures. Children, sitting on straw mats, woven carpets, or carved wooden benches, listened wide-eyed, imagining themselves as the protagonists, wielding swords or rescuing princesses. In some cases, parents might commission a special song mentioning the child, though this was more common in very wealthy families, like those of dukes, counts, barons, or feudal lords. For example, in a 14th-century Burgundian court, a noble child might hear a troubadour recite a poem praising their lineage, mentioning their ancestors and their future as a knight, with a final verse including their name, prompting laughter and applause from those present. In courts in Provence, Catalonia, or southern Italy, troubadours might accompany their songs with instruments like the lute, vihuela, flute, harp, or cittern, adding a touch of sophistication to the evening. Adults, meanwhile, might toast with spiced wine served in pewter, silver, or, in wealthier families, blown glass goblets, a luxury reserved for special occasions that showcased the household's wealth. High infant mortality was an inescapable factor that gave special weight to birthdays, particularly the early ones. In the Middle Ages, many children didn't reach age 5 due to diseases like the bubonic plague, dysentery, smallpox, whooping cough, typhoid fever, or malnutrition, as well as common household or field accidents, like falls from trees, burns from getting too close to the fire, injuries with farm tools, or drownings in rivers or wells. For this reason, the first and second birthdays could be deeply significant moments for both the family and the community, who saw the child's survival as a small miracle. In some regions, like France, the Holy Roman Empire, Castile, Aragon, or northern Italy, families marked the first birthday with specific rituals designed to protect the child and give thanks for their survival. For example, they might wrap the child in a cloth blessed by a priest during a special mass, often woven by the mother or grandmother from linen or wool, or take them to church for a blessing, where the priest sprinkled holy water on their head while reciting a prayer for health and protection, like Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." In England, some peasant families had the tradition of cutting a lock of the child's hair and keeping it in a small cloth or leather pouch, sometimes embroidered with a simple cross or flower, believing this amulet protected against the evil eye, malevolent spirits, or illness. In rural Italian communities, like those in Tuscany, Umbria, the Marche, or Lazio, mothers might tie a red cord around the child's arm during their first birthday, a practice blending Christian beliefs with local superstitions about warding off supernatural forces, like the Italian Malocchio. In some communities in southern Spain, especially in regions influenced by Andalusi culture, families might place a sprig of rosemary, bay, basil, or thyme under the child's pillow, believing these herbs brought good luck, protection, or peaceful dreams, often blessed by a priest or imam before use. In Slavic lands, like Poland, Bohemia, Moravia, or the Baltic regions, families might sprinkle salt around the child's cradle, place a polished stone under their mattress, or light a small fire outside the house to ward off evil spirits, like the domovoi or forest spirits from local folklore. In some communities, mothers might sing traditional songs telling stories of pagan gods repurposed as Christian saints, like Street Olaf in Norway, a former Viking hero turned Christian symbol, or St. Bridget in Ireland, whose February 1st feast blended with Celtic Imbolc traditions, celebrating the start of spring with bonfires and milk offerings. As children grew, birthdays could lose importance, especially for boys, who often began working or training for a trade from age 7 or 8, when childhood began to fade quickly. In peasant families, a child of this age might already be responsible for tasks like herding goats, sheep, cows, or pigs, gathering firewood in the forest, helping with planting or harvesting wheat, barley, rye, or oats, fetching water from a well or river, or cleaning stables, fully integrating them into the adult world of work. In cities, children might start as apprentices in artisan workshops, learning trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, tailoring, baking, shoemaking, or weaving, spending hours observing and practicing under a master's strict gaze. For girls, birthdays could reinforce their role in the family, with gifts reflecting the domestic skills they were expected to master for their future as wives, mothers, or, in some cases, nuns. A 9-year-old girl, for example, might receive a spindle for spinning, a needle for sewing, a small loom, fabric for embroidery, or even a small prayer book if the family could afford it. These gifts weren't just practical. They marked the transition to adult responsibilities, as girls began learning these tasks from an early age, often under the guidance of their mother, aunt, grandmother, or older sister, who taught them to weave blankets, sew clothes, prepare food, or manage a household. Yet even in these cases, small gestures, like a special meal, a moment of play with other children, or a family blessing, remained ways to celebrate life in a world where each year was a blessing, especially in a context where average life expectancy was much lower, and many didn't reach adulthood. In medieval Jewish communities, birthdays also had a more spiritual than festive focus, reflecting the importance of faith and community in a context where Jewish families often lived under social pressure, legal restrictions, or even persecution in a Christian-dominated world. In cities like Toledo, Cordoba, Seville, Cologne, Prague, Worms, Mainz, Regensburg, or even London, a birthday might be marked with a blessing in the synagogue, where the rabbi or a community member recited a special prayer for the child's health, protection, and wisdom, often based on psalms like Psalm 91, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High," or Psalm 121, "I lift up my eyes to the hills." Children, especially boys, might receive a small prayer book, like a siddur with daily prayers, a rolled parchment with a protective verse, or an amulet known as a kamea, inscribed with Hebrew words believed to guard against evil, illness, or accidents. These celebrations were discreet, as Jewish communities had to maintain a low profile to avoid conflict with Christian authorities or neighbors, but they were deeply meaningful within the family context, where faith and tradition were central. In some cases, families might share a special meal, like unleavened bread with honey, dried fruits, like figs, dates, or raisins, or an almond cake, a typical sweet in Sephardic communities in Al-Andalus, blending Jewish and Arab culinary influences. In Ashkenazi communities in Central and Northern Europe, like Germany or Poland, children might receive a small pendant with a Hebrew inscription, like Shalom or a Star of David, or a cloth pouch embroidered with Jewish symbols, serving as a sign of identity and protection. In Toledo, Cordoba, or Granada, where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim cultural influences intertwined, children might receive a gift blending these traditions, like a ring with Hebrew and Arabic inscriptions, a necklace with a small hand-shaped amulet, similar to the Muslim hamsa, or a wooden box decorated with geometric patterns, reflecting the region's cultural richness. In the Islamic world, present in Al-Andalus for much of the Middle Ages, birthdays were also more tied to religious gratitude than festivity, reflecting Islamic values and the importance of community. In cities like Cordoba, Granada, Seville, Malaga, Toledo, or Valencia, a child might receive a blessing from their parents, often recited in Arabic with Quranic verses, like Surah Al-Fatiha, Surah Al-Ikhlas, or a specific dua for the child's health, wisdom, and protection. Gifts might include an embroidered tunic with colored threads, red, blue, green, or gold, depending on the family's resources, a simple copper, silver, or even gold ring in wealthier families, a cloth pouch embroidered with geometric or calligraphic designs, or a sweet made of almonds and honey, known as halva or turin in some regions, a highly prized delicacy reserved for special occasions. Muslim families might gather for a special meal, often in a tiled courtyard or a room with woven carpets, with dishes like couscous with vegetables and spices, like cumin, saffron, coriander, or cinnamon, roasted meats, like lamb or chicken, or sweets made with dates, nuts, almonds, pistachios, or rosewater, an ingredient that added a delicate aroma to desserts. In some cases, parents might recite a traditional poem, a nasht, religious song, or a prayer, asking for protection, prosperity, and guidance for the child in their new year of life. In rural areas of Al-Andalus, where Muslim families lived off agriculture, celebrations might be simpler, with a meal of bread, goat cheese, olives, figs, or dates, but they were still moments of gratitude for the child's life, marked by prayer recitations and food sharing. In cities, children might join small family gatherings in courtyards decorated with fountains and plants, where adults told stories, recited poetry, or sang traditional songs while children played with leather balls, small clay figures, or rudimentary board games, like early versions of chess or checkers, which were becoming popular in Al-Andalus due to Arab cultural influences. A curious detail is the absence of candles in birthday celebrations, a tradition we now associate inseparably with modern birthdays. In the Middle Ages, candles, made of beeswax or tallow, were expensive and primarily used for lighting or religious rituals. Beeswax, produced by local beehives maintained by monks, peasants, or specialized beekeepers, was a valuable commodity often reserved for churches, monasteries, or noble families, where it was used to light altars or chapels. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were more common in peasant homes but had an unpleasant smell, produced smoke, and could be dangerous in wooden houses with thatched roofs. If a family lit a candle on a birthday, it was more likely part of a prayer than a festive decoration. Imagine a scene in a 12th century English village, a family gathered around a rough wooden table, with a single tallow candle flickering in the dim light, its wavering glow illuminating the tired but hopeful faces of the parents, not to be blown out but to give thanks to heaven that the child was still alive. This symbolism was far deeper than any modern piñata, reflecting the fragility of life in an era where disease, accidents, and hunger were constant threats. In some regions, like parts of Italy, France, or Spain, families might light a candle in the local church and let it burn through the entire Mass in honor of the child, a practice combining devotion with a touch of solemnity, often accompanied by an offering, like a coin or a loaf of bread, for the church's upkeep. In Muslim communities in Al-Andalus, families might use oil lamps instead of candles, lighting a clay lamp with olive oil and a linen or cotton wick to illuminate the home during a family prayer, creating a warm and spiritual atmosphere. Birth records were also a challenge, especially in rural areas where literacy was low and precise calendars were rare, even among local clergy. Families didn't always keep written records of birth dates, and parents might recall a child's birth in general terms, like when the river flooded, after St. Michael's feast, when the new priest arrived, when the white calf was born, or when the feudal lord came to collect taxes. This made birthdays more of an approximate concept than a fixed date, often celebrated on an estimated day or combined with a nearby religious festival, like a saint's day, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, or Epiphany. For example, a child born in late December might have their birthday absorbed into Christmas celebrations, when families attended solemn masses in churches decorated with holly, ivy, mistletoe, or pine and shared a more abundant meal with white bread, roasted meat, like pork, lamb, or goose, if affordable, fish in coastal areas, or a special stew with spices like cloves, cinnamon, or ginger, reserved for significant occasions. During Epiphany on January 6th, families might celebrate with a special bread containing a coin, a dried bean, a nut, or a small wooden figure, a tradition believed to have inspired the modern king's cake, where the child who found the object was crowned king for the day, to everyone's delight, often allowed to give playful orders to their siblings or friends. In cities, especially after the 13th century, parish records became more common, allowing for more accurate tracking of birth dates, as baptisms, typically performed a few days after birth, were carefully recorded in church books, written with quill and ink on parchment or, increasingly, paper. However, even in these cases, birthday celebrations remain secondary to religious priorities, like attending Mass, participating in processions, or fulfilling liturgical duties, or the practical demands of daily life, like preparing for the harvest, paying feudal taxes, repairing farm tools, preserving food for winter, or preparing clothing for the colder months. In Scandinavian regions, pagan traditions still influence celebrations, despite the progressive Christianization that began in the 10th century and solidified in the 11th and 12th centuries. In some communities, children might receive a carved wooden amulet with protective runes, like Algies, protection, Tiwaz, strength and honor, or Othala, home and heritage, often crafted by a family member, village elder, or local artisan and hung around the child's neck with a leather cord or kept in a hand-sewn cloth pouch. In some Norwegian, Swedish, or Danish villages, families might share a fermented barley drink, non-alcoholic for children, served in a ceremonial horn or wooden, bone, or antler bowl, passed from hand to hand as a symbol of unity and gratitude for the child's life. In an 11th century Norwegian village, for example, a child celebrating a birthday might receive a small carved figure of a Viking ship, a wolf, a raven, or a bear, animals tied to Norse mythology and seen as symbols of strength, cunning, protection, or courage in a world where the sea and nature were central to life and identity. In other regions, like the Slavic lands of Poland, Bohemia, Moravia, Silesia, or the Baltic areas, birthdays might include rituals blending Christian and pagan elements, such as placing protective herbs like rosemary, rue, sage, or thyme under the child's pillow, sprinkling salt around their cradle, placing a polished stone under their mattress, or lighting a small fire outside the house to ward off evil spirits like the domovoi, or forest spirits. In some communities, mothers might sing traditional songs about pagan gods repurposed as Christian saints, like Street Olaf in Norway, a former Viking hero turned Christian symbol, or Saint Bridget in Ireland, whose February 1st feast blended with Celtic Imbolc traditions, celebrating spring's arrival with bonfires and milk offerings. Food was a key aspect of any celebration, but in the Middle Ages, diets were limited, especially for the lower classes, who made up the majority of the population. Black bread, made from rye, barley, oats, or a mix of grains, porridge from wheat, millet, or oats, vegetable soup, with turnips, cabbages, leeks, onions, or wild carrots. And with luck, a bit of cheese, butter, bacon, or dried meat were the norm in peasant households. A birthday might be a chance to enjoy something out of the ordinary, like a piece of bacon, a boiled egg, a baked apple with honey, a handful of wild berries, like blackberries, currants, or blueberries, a roll sweetened with dried fruits, like figs, raisins, or dates, or even some fresh milk if the family had a cow or goat. In coastal areas, like villages in Brittany, Galicia, Cornwall, the Baltic coast, or Mediterranean islands, a fresh fish, like herring, sardine, cod, or trout, might be the star of the celebration, often grilled over a wood fire, boiled in a stew with wild herbs, or sun-dried for preservation. In inland regions, like Castile, Leon, Bavaria, Swabia, or Bohemia, families might slaughter a chicken, rabbit, or, in rare cases, a pig for a birthday if resources allowed, sharing it among all family members, with the child receiving the largest or juiciest portion, like the thigh or liver, considered delicacies. In noble courts, feasts were far more elaborate, with roasted meats like lamb, pork, venison, boar, or poultry, like pheasant, partridge, or capon. White bread, a luxury compared to peasant black bread, as white wheat was more expensive and harder to grow. And in some cases, exotic spices like cinnamon, cloves, pepper, nutmeg, ginger, or saffron, which were incredibly costly, often worth more than gold, and reserved for the wealthiest families. A noble child celebrating a birthday in a court in France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, or Italy might feel like a little king if served a dish with a touch of saffron, a spice so valuable it was often locked in a wooden chest. In cities, bakers' guilds might prepare breads decorated with cumin, anise, poppy, or sesame seeds, or shaped into symbolic forms like crosses, circles, stars, or even animals, shared on special occasions like birthdays or religious festivals. If you're fascinated by this dive into the Middle Ages, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have more content about daily life, traditions, and curious details that made this era unique. Join us and keep exploring the past. As for gifts, these were usually practical rather than sentimental, reflecting the medieval mindset where utility was valued over emotional symbolism, especially in a world where resources were scarce and every object had a purpose. A child might receive a new pair of shoes, made from leather tanned by a local shoemaker, a woolen cloak to ward off the winter cold, a leather belt with an iron or bronze buckle, or, in the case of artisans' children, a small tool related to the family trade. For example, a blacksmith's son might receive a small hammer, not for immediate use but as a symbol of his future in the workshop, where he'd learn to forge horseshoes, nails, tools, or even swords. A carpenter's son might get a small chisel, a wooden mallet, or a piece of wood carved with his initial, a gesture initiating him into the family trade and teaching the value of manual labor. A baker's son might receive a small mold for rolls or a wooden spatula, while a weaver's son might get a spool of thread or a miniature shuttle. For girls, gifts might include household items, like a wooden or bone comb, a sewing needle, a small loom, fabric for embroidery, or even a small cauldron for practicing cooking, often accompanied by lessons from their mother, aunt, grandmother, or older sister on weaving blankets, sewing clothes, preparing food, or managing a household. These gifts weren't just practical. They marked the transition to adult responsibilities, as girls began learning these tasks from an early age, often at 7 or 8, to prepare for their future as wives, mothers, or, in some cases, nuns. In wealthier families, gifts could be more elaborate, like a leather-bound prayer book, a rosary with wooden, bone, or, in rare cases, amber or coral beads, a bronze or silver medallion with a saint's image, or a wooden box decorated with carvings or metal inlays. In noble courts, a boy might receive a wooden horse, a practice sword made of oak, or a miniature suit of armor, while a girl might get an embroidered dress, a polished metal mirror, or a small jewelry box for future adornments. Songs also had their place in celebrations, though not the typical birthday tunes we know today, like Happy Birthday. Instead, families might sing religious hymns, psalms, or folk songs that varied by region, culture, and social context. In England, ballads about local heroes, like early versions of Robin Hood, Beowulf, or St. George stories, were common, often sung by the family around the fire or by a traveling minstrel in a tavern or square. In France, troubadours might compose simple verses to entertain children, sometimes adapting them to include the child's name or a blessing for their new year, like May Saint Michael guard you, or May the Virgin protect you. In rural areas, songs might be simpler, like rhymes about the harvest, the cycle of seasons, field animals, or saint stories, sung around a bonfire while the family shared a meal. In noble courts, minstrels might perform more elaborate songs, accompanied by instruments like the lute, vihuela, flute, harp, cittern, or psaltery, adding sophistication to the evening. For example, in a court in Provence, Catalonia, or northern Italy, a noble child might hear a song narrating a knight's exploits, with a final verse mentioning their name as a future hero, prompting laughter and applause from those present. In rural Scandinavian communities, songs might include echoes of Norse sagas, telling stories of gods like Odin or Thor, repurposed as Christian figures, while in Slavic lands, songs might speak of mythical heroes or forest spirits, blending pagan and Christian elements in a unique cultural tapestry. In urban areas, birthdays could have a more social component, especially in commercial cities like Nuremberg, Bruges, Florence, Cologne, London, Paris, Barcelona, Venice, or Genoa, where communities were more interconnected and guilds played a significant role in social life. Children of artisan, merchant, or petty bourgeois families might gather with neighborhood kids to share a meal or play games, creating a festive atmosphere that broke the monotony of daily life. In these cities, parents might organize a small gathering at home, in a courtyard, or in a rented tavern room, where children played games like King of the Hill, competing to stay atop a mound, pile of straw, or makeshift platform, or threw stones at a target drawn on the ground or a wall to test their aim. In urban areas of Italy, like Venice, Genoa, or Pisa, children might play water games, like throwing stones into a canal to see who made the most ripples, building small wooden boats to float in a nearby stream, or racing along the docks, dodging barrels, fishing nets, and carts of goods. In Mediterranean cities like Barcelona, Valencia, or Malaga, children might play Moors and Christians, a child's reenactment of battles between Christians and Muslims, where they split into two teams and used sticks as swords in a game full of laughter, shouts, and drama. These activities weren't exclusive to birthdays but could make the day feel special, especially if the child received extra attention, an extra sweet, like a piece of gingerbread, a honey biscuit decorated with anise seeds, or a candied fruit, or a small prize, like a copper coin or a colorful ribbon, for winning a game. And if you want to learn more about this topic, I've linked a book in the description that dives deeper. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to explore the details of medieval life, from celebrations to the daily challenges families faced. As children grew, birthdays could become less significant, especially for boys, who often began working or training for a trade from age 7 or 8, when childhood quickly faded in a world where survival depended on collective labor. In peasant families, a child of this age might already be responsible for herding goats, sheep, cows, or pigs, gathering firewood in the forest, helping with planting or harvesting wheat, barley, rye, or oats, fetching water from a well or river, cleaning stables, or repairing wooden fences. In cities, children might start as apprentices in artisan workshops, learning trades like blacksmithing, forging nails or horseshoes, carpentry, crafting furniture or beams, tailoring, cutting and sewing clothes, baking, kneading dough or tending the oven, shoemaking, tanning leather or stitching shoes, or weaving, operating looms to produce fabrics. These apprentices often lived with the master artisan, working long hours in exchange for food, lodging, and the promise of learning a trade to secure their future. For girls, birthdays could serve as reminders of their family role, with gifts reinforcing the domestic skills they were expected to master for their future as wives, mothers, or nuns. A 9-year-old girl, for example, might receive a spindle for spinning, a sewing needle, a small loom, fabric for embroidery, a small cauldron for cooking practice, or even a prayer book if the family could afford it, especially in noble or bourgeois households. These gifts weren't just practical. They marked the transition to adult responsibilities, as girls began learning these tasks from an early age, often under the guidance of their mother, aunt, grandmother, or older sister, who taught them to weave blankets, sew clothes, prepare food, manage a household, or care for younger siblings. In noble families, birthdays could carry additional meaning, marking milestones in the child's education and training, especially for boys, who began preparing for roles as knights, administrators, or clerics. A 7-year-old noble boy might start training as a page in a court or castle, learning skills like riding a horse, wielding a wooden sword, serving at a lord's table, or even reading and writing in Latin if the family had access to a tutor. By 14, he might become a squire, assisting a knight in tournaments or battles and honing martial skills. For noble girls, birthdays could mark the start of formal education in embroidery, music, dance, courtly etiquette, or household management, preparing them for their future roles as wives of knights, lords, or princes, or as abbesses in a convent. For example, a 12-year-old noble girl in a French or English court might receive an embroidered dress with gold or silver threads, a polished metal mirror, a carved wooden jewelry box, or even a small lute for practicing music, a sign of her status and preparation for courtly life. In monastic communities, children living in monasteries or educated by monks, known as oblates, children offered to the church by their families, often as an act of devotion or to secure an education, also had ways of marking birthdays, though these were extremely austere and subordinate to religious discipline. An oblate child might receive a special blessing during morning mass, often recited by the abbot or a senior monk, or a small privilege, like an extra portion of food, such as a piece of white bread, some cheese, or an apple. A day off from certain tasks, like copying manuscripts, cleaning the cloister, or working in the monastery garden, or a moment of private prayer in the chapel. In some Benedictine, Cistercian, or Augustinian monasteries, the abbot might read a scripture passage in the child's honor, like a psalm or a gospel parable, to remind them of their commitment to faith and their life dedicated to God. In convents, oblate girls might receive similar gifts, like a ribbon to mark their prayer book, a wooden rosary, or a small carved cross, but the austerity of monastic life limited any excess, and celebrations were always imbued with humility and devotion. The community's role was fundamental in the Middle Ages, where life was deeply collective, and birthdays, though personal, were often celebrated in the context of the family, village, neighborhood, or guild. Neighbors might join the celebration, bringing small gifts like a handful of walnuts, hazelnuts, or chestnuts, a sprig of aromatic herbs, like rosemary, thyme, or lavender, a homemade tallow candle, a fresh egg, an apple, or even a piece of cloth, as a gesture of goodwill and solidarity. In rural areas, these offerings were especially valuable, as every resource was scarce and represented significant effort. In cities, guilds could play an important role, especially if the child's father was a member of one, like the bakers, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, shoemakers, or merchants' guilds. For example, in a city like Nuremberg, Bruges, or Florence, a baker's child might receive a roll decorated with cumin, anise, or poppy seeds, courtesy of the guild, or a small wooden toy carved by a carpenter friend of the family, like a horse, ship, or knight figure. In rural communities, neighbors might gather at the family's home to share a simple meal, like a lentil stew, black bread, and cheese, sing a folk song, or tell stories about saints, local heroes, or village legends, creating a sense of camaraderie that made the birthday a shared event beyond the child. The perception of time and age was also different in the Middle Ages, where children grew up fast, not only due to the need to contribute to family survival but because life expectancy was much lower, especially for the lower classes, where disease, malnutrition, and accidents significantly reduced the chances of reaching adulthood. A 10-year-old child might already be considered nearly an adult in terms of responsibilities, especially in peasant families, where they could work in the fields, tend animals, or perform household tasks alongside their parents and siblings. In noble families, boys began training as pages or squires at a young age, learning skills like riding, swordsmanship, serving at a lord's table, or even reading and writing in Latin if a tutor or cleric was available. Noble girls might be prepared for marriage, courtly life, or religious life from age 7 or 8, learning embroidery, music, household management, or praying the canonical hours. This meant that birthdays, after the early years, could lose significance as children became more integrated into the adult world, taking on roles that distanced them from childhood. However, in noble families, where education and martial or courtly training were crucial, birthdays could serve as milestones to mark a child's progress, like when a boy began training as a page, received his first wooden sword for practice, or was formally presented to the feudal lord. For noble girls, a birthday might mark the start of formal education in embroidery, music, dance, courtly etiquette, or household management, preparing them for their future roles as wives of knights, lords, or princes, or as abbesses in a convent. In summary, medieval children's birthdays were a blend of faith, community, and small gestures reflecting the era's values, challenges, and cultural nuances. There were no grand parties with extravagant decorations, multi-tiered cakes, or gifts wrapped in shiny paper, but there were moments of gratitude and joy, whether through a church blessing, a special loaf baked with care, a noisy game with friends in the village square, a protective amulet carved with effort, a song sung around the fire, or a meal shared with family and neighbors. These celebrations, though modest, were a way to acknowledge life in a world where each year was a gift, a miracle celebrated with humility and hope. Through regional differences, religious influences, social dynamics, and cultural practices in Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities, medieval children's birthdays offer a fascinating window into an era where the everyday and the spiritual intertwined uniquely, creating memories that, though simple, were deeply meaningful.